Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Is there a person named Ready? Because I'm as ready as that person, as ready as Ready has ever been. Then I'm ready.
Apparently. Hello, everyone. We are your geeky gentlemen, and if you haven't gathered by now, we're ready.
So ready.
We're so ready. I am a geek for fun,
Hey, what's up? I'm that Mac kid.
and today we're ready to discuss
Mm.
something that you're very hyped about.
So hyped.
And I
Yeah.
think I'm honestly surprised that because this is kind of such a geek cult kind of classic. His name always gets brought up in these kind of geeky gentleman circles. I'm surprised
hmm
there wasn't a video on the channel about this, but we're doing it now. 2020 is the year where everything just surprises us. So we are talking about Scott Pilgrim versus the world, and I need to pose you this question, Matt.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, one, because I just really fucking like Scott Pilgrim, both the comic and the movie. But two, because we're recording this in August of 2020, and that is the actual 10th anniversary of the U.S. and UK release dates. It was released other times, other places, but the U.S. and the UK release date was August of 2010. So this movie is a decade old, which is fucking crazy. There's actually just recently a charity table read. A bunch of the cast got together and did a table read of the whole movie, which you can still find on YouTube. So it's been in the public eye more recently. So I've just been thinking about it. And I rewatched it and kind of going back over the comics. And it's just something I adore. I really love this movie. I love the comics and no real special reason other than just it's kind of been on in the zeitgeist a little bit more this year. So I thought today would be a good time to talk about it.
hmm Okay. I think it's generally always a good period as well because just in general with the kind of cinema industry and theaters being in such an uncertain place right now, and this
Mhm.
film kind of being influential in a bad sense, but also influential in a good sense, in that first off, before we get into the film itself, this film didn't make a lot of money. It was kind of a flop.
Yep.
Because the people behind it didn't really understand that fan reaction for Edgar Wright specifically and for kind of a niche material doesn't necessarily always market into mass appeal. And so they kind of banked on it being there, and as a result, it flopped. But the benefit of that is it gave Edgar Wright all the money he needed to do his vision without any compromises, and it's a good showcase for any filmmakers of just what you can do if you don't try and make a studio film. If you just make your film and just go out there, because there's a lot of things in this which would, especially if because I've done a lot of looking up at this. Like when people give you writing advice or direction advice, which is normally always really bad, there's so many things in this that this film breaks, and
Oh
just
yeah.
shows you that all of that is bullshit. So I think this is a good time to talk about this because maybe with this break, any aspiring filmmakers listen to this, or just people working on their own individual projects, can maybe take a look at this and the lessons you take away from it, the lessons you don't take away from it, and how you apply that to your own creative endeavors. Because a lot of this film is meant to be self reflection, and specifically for creative people as well, um, getting over yourself in a lot of ways. So I think that's important right now while people do have obviously so many people in different situations, but just in general with creative endeavors, there's kind of been like a brakes put on things. So while you've got this time, it's always a good time to reflect and rethink. And Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a great film for that.
Yeah, I mean the outpouring of creativity that was just dumped into this movie is crazy. It's a film that somehow manages to move at like a lightning quick pace without feeling like you've been shortchanged any real moments of character building or anything like that. I mean, it's a movie that just moves from scene to scene, from shot to shot, so fast, so like you almost barely have time to keep up with what's going on, but yet you feel like you're with these characters each moment of it. I mean, it's a great movie. The way it handles, the story of someone who's getting over these things that have sort of dragged them down for years of their life. I think it's a very easy story to connect to, and I think it's no wonder that it became such a cult classic. Because I mean, yeah, it had a budget of I think like 90 million, and it didn't even do like half of that. And part of that was because of how they marketed it. It was kind of more marketed as like a typical like Michael Cera teen comedy, sort of in the realm of something like I guess Juno or something like that. I think if the marketing had leaned more into the just insane craziness of what Edgar Wright was making, and really showcased the crazy action, the over the top fun, I think this might have had a chance. Um, it's really hard to say. I mean, the story of how the comics got adapted into the movie is a pretty interesting story and things like that. But as a film, I'm always so happy that this got made. It's such a pure vision of those comics and such a pure adaptation. I really don't see a movie like this ever really happening again, but it's definitely one that's been very influential and important to me. It came out when I was, still in the middle of high school, and I just love it to pieces.
And that's one of the things where just looking at the film itself for a minute, and if we just break it down into what we think of just a general movie, and then we can go off in so many different directions. Because this as well is not just a film; it is an adaptation which has had other adaptations. Like there's Scott Pilgrim video game, there's Scott Pilgrim
Mhm.
comic book. Like there's a lot of other ways you can look at how many worlds Scott Pilgrim has been fighting. It's quite a few mediums. So just looking at this as a film on its own. What always strikes me whenever I go back and watch this, and I tend to watch this quite a few times, um, is the sheer. This is an unapologetic film,
Mhm.
and I love that so much. Not just in film, but in any creative who just does not give a fuck is like my hero. Whenever
Yeah.
people say, "Oh well, we're just doing this for the fans," I want to just slap them in the face. I'm like, no, fuck the fans. Do it for you. I don't care what the fans think. The fans don't know anything. What do you think? When that creative just is completely unapologetic about their vision and they're good
Mhm.
at it. Oh boy,
Yeah.
that's some master craftsmanship right there, and that's what this is. Edgar Wright is
Mhm.
so good at just he wrote the script for this as well. I'm correct.
Yeah, he was at least involved in the screen. It was him and Michael Bacall, who I don't immediately recognize. I think he did. I think he did the. I think he worked on like 21 Jump Street or something like that. But it's him and Michael Bacall, who wrote the screenplay for it. They actually worked with the original writer Brian Lee O'Malley, who actually, and we'll get into it more and more, but certain things about how the story played out are actually alternative ideas that Brian Lee O'Malley had for the comics that he just didn't end up using, particularly with the ending. So it's kind of cool because you can kind of look at these as two like alternate realities that kind of played out slightly differently. Um, so it's cool to have a situation where Edgar Wright is involved in the writing process, and it's 100% his vision of this story for sure. But there is also that really healthy relationship with who first originated the material. And I think having that relationship there only served to make it a better film.
Hmm. So that's interesting then, because what I was about to say in relation to that was that it's such a Edgar Wright film, and I'm
Hmm.
a big fan of his filmography, but even compared to his stuff that isn't adaptations of other people's work, like Shaun of the Dead, like Hot Fuzz, this really just captures that spirit of his cuts, his visual style, his willingness, like I say, I go back to that word, unapologetic, his willingness to just go weird and not
Hmm.
spend an entire scene explaining what just happened. He's just like, you're either in with this ride or you're not. And to be fair, this might be big British boy Alfie being elitist cook as usual. But I think that does put a lot of people off sometimes. When a creator
Hmm.
doesn't try to cater to them and doesn't try to
Hmm.
hold them hands through something. I think a lot of people do like, well, they get too wrapped up in their own heads and they can't follow it. And that's not necessarily a negative thing. Everyone experiences media differently, but it's certainly not how I enjoy media. I am always for just tell your story, show your visuals, and if you're good at it, it will make emotional sense more so than it on like a dream logic thing. This film mentions dreams quite a lot, and we use the imagery of the mind quite a lot, which is all the conceit you really need to justify all these big, big ideas. Because if you sit down and break them down, a lot of every one of these fights, like the real big spectacle action scenes, all of them are built on a emotion or a flaw or something relating to the character specifically. The powers aren't random. They
Hmm.
are specifically given to each individual person for their specific things, and then that's how they're defeated, is by finding the weakness of that. So it's there on an emotional level, it's there on a thematic level. So if you're willing to ride with it, it's there for you. But
Hmm.
also, this film as well definitely leans into the video game appeal of it, all the way down to just the Universal logo being pixelized at the start, and the whole game plays out structurally closer to a video game plot than a movie plot, which probably lends itself to an adaptation. You could say Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is the only good video game movie because it's not tried. It's almost reverse engineered rather than that. It's a tribute to video games rather than actually trying to emulate them. Though I think I forget if the Scott Pilgrim video game came out before or after this.
That's still a fresh wound, unfortunately. I do believe it came out after. I unfortunately did not get to play it that much until it got taken down because copyright shit, and it hasn't been available for purchase or to be played in fucking years because it just got delisted and that was it. But no, it came out around the same time. It came out like at the same time as the movie. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's so much video game and anime influence in this, from the way that fights are shot to the sort of visual presentation of everything, to the way that the movie goes out of its way to use a lot of a lot of different graphics and a lot of different things on screen that are just straight up, like whenever you start to fight, you got like the verses, like it's a game of Street Fighter or something like that. So I mean, it's it's just this story that you're right. It's not really about gaming necessarily, but it manages to capture and say something about that, and it manages to kind of so well embody all these different things. There's a little bit of anime, there's a little bit of video games, there's a little bit of nerdy comic book stuff. And it feels like someone taking all these things that they have this passion for and just hurling it up on the screen, and having the creativity and having um, the talent to make it work. I think if you give this material to a director who's unwilling to go so hard with it, like you were saying, like Edgar Wright was willing to, or if you give it to a director who would but don't back them creatively, yeah, this would be an awful film. They'd be trying to explain what is happening. They'd be trying to explain how all of this is happening instead of just leaning into the insanity of it. I think the film actually explains things a little bit less than the book does. I mean, part of that is just because the book is longer, of course. Um, but you just kind of roll with it, and you just kind of accept that this is what's happening, because the story is not really about, you don't need to know why um, Scott is suddenly, a master martial artist who's fighting these guys with superpowers. You don't really need to know why. You just need to know what it means, and you need to know, what that's saying about the story. And that's something that it's kind of like in movies in general, right? I mean, like with a lot of fantasy films, a lot of nerds get so focused on, how is a character able to do all these things? Because lore wise, how are they able to? It's like, well, it doesn't. What does it tell us about the story? What does it mean? And so this movie just kind of leans into that and doesn't even bother explaining anything, because it knows that, that's not the important thing here. Um, and so it's definitely a breath of fresh air as a movie, especially at the time. I could see, if this came out now, I could see it being a lot more popular. Whereas in 2010, I can see maybe people just not really being as, I don't want to say the world just wasn't ready for it yet, but I could it's ahead of its time. It's a masterpiece. But like, kind of, right? Like, I feel like this is something that almost would have been more well received as you get a little bit closer to now than maybe back in 2010.
I think that's the exact situation that we're seeing though, right? Is you see so much love. Scott Pilgrim versus the World, even though it wasn't written with that in mind, because it's definitely playing up more on the people involved being closer to like the 90s arcade video game generation and the
Mm-hmm.
feelings of being that kind of tribute. But it is so transcendent to being the perfect millennial slash Zoomer movie.
Yeah.
It feels so perfectly for the age of social media, the age of the console wars, and everything with video game experiences being so immersive, and to the point where, like, if they were going to make a Scott Pilgrim game now, make it VR and now just reenact all the fight scenes. Because you can do that now. So, like, there is. I think it is ahead of its time, and surely that emotionally it predicted kind of a resurgence of the young teen angst is so entwined with video game culture these days, to the where now nerd is just been replaced with gamer
Right.
as like the jock thing. But even the jocks are playing video games. Like everyone's it's so more ingrained with our culture. It was pretty ingrained in 2010, but it's not even close to how it is now.
Well, and I
Um,
think there's another subset that this movie hits on really well that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is like the indie music hipster people,
oh, for
right?
sure, for
Like this,
sure.
Scott Pilgrim is the name of a song by a band called Plumtree. And this movie, just with the sound of Sex Bomb and the sound of Clash at Demon Head, where they do Black Sheep by Metric, which is a really great song. Brie Larson covers it, and it's phenomenal. There's that nerd culture, and then there's also that very much that like hipster indie music scene. So I mean, this really just it finds a way to capture something, just this aesthetic that's all kind of based on these sort of insular kind of nerdy groups that all have a lot of overlap. I mean, you'll talk to a lot of people in indie music scenes who are big nerds, who are big comic book and anime nerds, and there is a good amount of overlap there. Um, and so this really just finds a way to lean into all of those different communities, and really find something that I think kind of taps into this kind of cool joint aesthetic that I think appeals to a really broad group of people once you look at all of those communities kind of put together.
And that's probably why it has taken such a, I guess, like beloved circle with so many different people from so many different walks of life, because it does have that broad appeal where different people can look at it from different lenses, because it is trying to cover so many different bases. And even
Hmm.
so much with the fact of with the evil ex-boyfriends, you've got so many different walks of life there, which are meant in part just to give cool set pieces and just get to the pure ridiculousness of it. What would a video game fight be with Chris Evans, the movie star? Be like, I did just you run with it, right? But like that's also each one of them. It's not focused on, but just how tight this film is written. Each
Hmm.
one you get a motive for, like, oh yeah, I can see why they got together. Like it's you can buy
Yeah.
Ramona Flowers being with all of these people. Then you can in some films with like an entire film dedicated to one relationship.
Yeah,
For
no,
like these bit
it's
characters, yeah.
Mhm. And it's all in the strength of the character work and the character writing. It's not just that every character is well written in a way that you kind of get there because they're exaggerations because this is kind of this over the top cartoonish world. So you meet Lucas Lee, for example, and he is like the most exaggerated version of like kind of a douchebag who's like full of himself and stuff like that you could like possibly have. And so you immediately latch onto that, but then it's the charm of how well written that character is, and then of course the performances in this movie are all just phenomenal. And so there's this perfect storm of great writing with great casting with great direction. I don't. This movie like literally fires on all cylinders. Like I don't think there's a single part of like a typical film production from like just the basic cinematography to the acting to the sound design to the casting to I don't think there's a single thing here that could have been that was like a missed opportunity. And so I think the combination of all those things is what makes these characters feel just so real. The only ones that you really don't get to spend time with at all would be like the Kadiyanagi twins. And at that point, that's just because you've got seven evil exes. You gotta make some cuts somewhere.
That's what I was curious to get your opinion on. As a fan of the comics, because I've actually never read them. Uh,
Yeah.
does this film feel like you're missing something, or the changes made here? Because again, from people probably gathering, is what I'm gathering, it's very glowingly positive. But I've yet to see Scott Pilgrim fans talk about like the differences between adaptations. Are there things you prefer from the comics, things you don't like? The you mentioned earlier the story of the it going from comic to screen. Like, take us there. I'm really curious to hear like everything about that aspect, this movie's
Yeah.
relationship with the comic book.
Cool, because that's what I've been fucking prepared to talk about all week. Um, so Brian Lee O'Malley, he was new to the world of. He was a cartoonist in Canada. He wanted to make something that was kind of a shonen manga esque type thing. He tells a story about how he was inspired because his wife, it might have been his girlfriend at the time, had dated like three different guys all named Matt, and so he was like, "There's like a league of evil Matts out there," and that was kind of his story. He made the first book, and Oni Press was immediately like, "Hey, let's maybe shop this around for some film adaptations." And he was just like, "There's no way you're gonna give this to someone and me like it, but I'm broke and so whatever." Um, and Edgar Wright had actually known about it, so it gets into his hands, and he immediately becomes very interested in it. And that was a godsend for Brian because he figured that if a studio got their hands on it, it would just be just it wouldn't be really what he had written. But Edgar Wright had such a love for the material that those two started talking, and this movie was in production while the books were still being made. It was very much kind of like a Harry Potter situation. I mean, really, the books were still being made while the screenplay was getting written, and so there's a lot of kind of interplay there. The books were originally in green, or I'm not green. I'm getting my story ahead of myself. The books were originally in black and white. So, for example, the deveganizing Ray being green was Edgar Wright's idea because he's like, we got Brandon Routh, so we got to make the deveganizing Ray green because Brandon Routh is Superman and Superman is weak to kryptonite and kryptonite's green, so we're gonna make it green. And Brian was just like, okay. And so when the official colored versions of the books come out, it's now green, and that was entirely because the movie did it green. So there was a lot of interplay, between these two as creatives. It was a very like healthy relationship, which is awesome. In terms of differences, I mean, the books take place over the span of a whole year, whereas the movie takes place over the span of like a week, maybe. Um, and so the books, this is kind of one of my go-to examples of a perfect adaptation, because essentially what they did was they looked at the books and they said, what's the core story here? Like, what is the important thing we want to tell? And then the rest of it can go away. So like the books, Kim Pine, the drummer in in Sex Bomb, she's a much more important character in the books. She's probably one of my favorite characters in the books. Envy Adams, Scott's ex, way more important in the books, like hugely important. She's actually there at the final showdown. But they kind of looked at it and they said, these things are all great and they all contribute to the overall sort of story that we're telling here, but we only have one movie that's going to be, max like 2 hours. And so I've just never seen it before. I mean, there is so much cut out, but you don't feel like anything's missing because it perfectly captures exactly what the important bits are from the book. So like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff like the Kadianagi twins aren't even characters anymore. Kim doesn't have as much to do. Envy doesn't have to do as much to do. Some characters are gone entirely. But I've never talked to a Scott Pilgrim fan who felt bad about it, because at the end of the day, the movie delivered on exactly what the core of the story is. So if the movie had kind of floundered about and not been a very good movie, I think you would have seen a lot more people upset that like, oh, well, all this stuff is missing. All the stuff with Envy is missing. All the stuff with, Todd cheating on Envy with the drummer of Clash at Demon Head. All that stuff is missing. What the heck? But it's like, it doesn't really need to be there, because at the end of the day, they were able to pare it down and really get at the heart of the story. So I don't know. I think it's a really great adaptation. And it's funny because some scenes play out exactly the same way. Like the scene where they're talking to Todd, the vegan, in like the backstage, and then Todd tosses them out the window. Like that all plays out exactly the same way. But they don't then have the base battle at that scene. They actually stop. And then they have the base battle like a few scenes later, like a couple days later. And so they kind of took that scene and just found a way to stitch them together naturally. And they did that throughout the book. There are lines of dialogue that show up in this, in the middle of the movie, that are lines of dialogue from the books, but they're from like the fourth or fifth book. Or fucking Roxy, the girl who's played by the girl evil ex who's played by Katara. Her weakness being the back of her knees is actually Envy's weakness in the books. In the book, Envy Adams and Ramona have like a big fight, and Envy's weakness is the back of her knees. So in this, they took that fight, made it Ramona and Roxy, and they gave that weakness to Roxy. So there's a lot of stuff like that. Like there's a shocking amount of stuff like that where it's like, okay, this is a callback to a thing in the book. It's not exactly what happens in the book, but the line is there or the idea is there. So it somehow manages to cut a bunch of stuff out while still keeping a ton of stuff in there. I like, honestly, I don't even know how you would begin to write this, because of just how much they're able to be like, wow, that's a line that shows up like 3 volumes from now in the comic, and they've got it like right here. So it's really impressive. The first act of this movie, like from the beginning up until beating Matthew Patel, that's pretty much the first book. Like the first act of this movie is pretty much exactly the first book with very little change, just a couple minor things cut out here and there. And then it's as you move forward that it gets more and more drastically different. But I mean, I could talk about the adaptation side of this all day, and I don't want to make this entirely into that, but it's a super interesting like reading the comics and going to the movie and kind of going back and forth between them is just a really kind of fun and interesting experience.
And that's always the benefit. Um, which I think a lot of fans, and the reason I bring that up is because a lot of fans, I think it's from a place of love. It's from a place of love for the original work. But the
Hmm.
idea that if an adaptation strays from anything, it's immediately tainted and bad and horrible.
Mm.
The thing I want to draw to, I guess, a positive example is kind of minor, but a lot of people did get hung up on about it, was the narration being taken away from the Dark Knight Returns animated movies of like because that's a
Hmm.
massive part of that book, but they just
Sure.
reworked it into dialogue. But a lot of fans just couldn't take it. Like, well, it's not. It will never ever be the Dark Knight Returns because it won't have the narration. It's not the thing. And then that's obviously a much more straight adaptation of that material than Scott Pilgrim is, just simply because it could be split into two films. But I think that's a key point where you're not when something is made to be a comic and it's done well, we're not talking like a Jeff Johns, this is clearly meant to be a movie pitch disguised as a comic book. uh, when something is designed as a comic and made to be a comic in the same way that Scott Pilgrim was, you would be doing a disservice if you did stay beholden to that because you're not making a comic, so it's never going to be as good as that. The only way to make it worthwhile and to make that endeavor not just from being boring as a creative is to say, okay, what does this look like as a film? What does this concept look like a film? What does the characters look like as a film? And
Hmm.
what needs to be adjusted accordingly to best work as in film? And that's why I think you're right when you said earlier that no one else really but Edgar Wright could have made this work. Because not only does it make the plot truncates, right? Like you change some of the characters' roles, you reduce some scenes here and there, you move some scenes here and there, and you kind of mix it. That's all like narrative, that's like in the script. Other people could do that, right? But if you just played that straight and you didn't have the directorial flair to bring in the crazy comic booky style fights as well, and
Hmm.
the on-screen video game depictors, and just how this film is cut, it
Yeah.
would not have the soul to make it even anywhere close as then you would get people complaining is like, well, if you're just going to do a straight take like that, you should just put everything in it. Because this has its own style completely unique from the book, just because it's Edgar Wright's thing. Um, it makes it easier to swallow. It's just like this is its own version of these characters in the story, but they're just as true to the spirit, and that's the most important thing. So no, I think you're right, and I think that's an important merit to praise this film on, because so many adaptations stumble at that. They either completely ignore the source material and just do their own thing to the point where it's unrecognizable, or they're so beholden to the source material that what's even the point?
Hmm. Yeah, for exactly. And it's interesting because for the most part, every character is exactly what they are in the comics. Weirdly, I think the biggest departures are Scott Pilgrim, Ramona, and Gideon. I think those are the three characters who are the most just kind of different from their comic book counterparts. But for the most part, pretty much everything it stays true to the material without feeling like it can't be different or it can't make changes that make sense for um for the medium that it's in. And so it's probably one of the best examples of an adaptation, but I wonder if it helps that most people were introduced to this as a movie.
Hmm.
This is not something where people had like some people did, obviously, because the book started coming out in like the mid 2000s. I think the first one came out in like 2005 or 2004, and the movie didn't come out till 2005 or 2010. So obviously there is going to be a segment of people who started reading these when they came out, and I would be really curious to talk to them because my introduction to this was like a lot of people's. I saw the movie first, and then went back and read the comics and fell in love with the comics, of course. But I do wonder if that's part of it because I mean, like you adapt Watchmen well, it's like Watchmen has been around forever and everyone knows it. And it's like a seminal work, and people have had time to sit there and think and discuss and talk about what Watchmen is and what Watchmen means. Scott Pilgrim didn't really get that treatment. It was a relatively unknown indie comic that got turned into a movie, and it being turned into a movie is what most people, that's how most people started to recognize it. So I wonder if it helps that most people saw the movie first.
I think that's definitely true. I think that's also in the case that this works as a movie first. Is the Watchmen is kind of built, and I think that's a great example because that is something where that is just a probably the best example we've ever seen of an adaptation to screen of just this is the book, minus a couple of details here and there, and like obviously the action thing, but it's deliberately shot as if the book was its storyboard. Scott
Yeah.
Pilgrim the comic is not this film storyboard.
Ew.
It's completely different structurally in every single facet of that. But the reason why it works just as a film prior is it's not necessarily trying to be made for Scott Pilgrim fans in the same way that when the comic was first made, it didn't have a fan base, so it's not trying to do the wink and the nudge, remember this reference
Hmm.
or remember this character. It's just presenting the story for what it is, which is the universal story of falling in love and specifically young, messy, toxic ass love. And the relationships that people have from that, and the friendship groups around that, and how that interacts with everything, and the wave of emotions and anxieties and the biggest things possible that make the crazy fights seem small and petty in comparison to just the feelings.
Hmm.
um, that I think just gives it this appeal of pure human experience that you don't need to be a fan of the comic books or even a fan of video games to get it, right? It's just got that
Yeah.
mass core human appeal. So one thing I want to take this direction is to start talking like an individual character level,
Hmm.
and probably our center focus. What do you think about movie Scott Pilgrim?
Movie Scott Pilgrim is interesting. He's less kind of happy go lucky than book Scott Pilgrim. Like book Scott Pilgrim smiles more, and his the thing about Scott Pilgrim as a character, and the thing that resonates with me so much, is that he's essentially the story. Like if you boil it down, it's essentially the story of a guy who's just a fucking absolute douchebag who doesn't even view himself that way. Like he somehow finds a way to be the victim in all of these situations. He finds a way to never accept responsibility for the things that he's done. He finds a way to always make it someone else's fault, never really wanting to own up to things, never really wanting to have enough self-respect to better himself. And without getting too personal, that's something that really hit me at the time. High school was a big period of change for me, which it is for a lot of people, but it definitely, I went through a lot of things. And so Scott really kind of resonated with me. So any story about just a fucking douchebag who just learns that he's a douchebag and is trying to better himself, that story is always something that resonates with me. Um, and so movie Scott, I think, really captures all that. He is less energetic and a little bit more kind of weird and awkward. But I think he still, like a lot of things, it's a little bit different than what's exactly in the book, but I think he still captures it perfectly. I think Michael Cera, it's it's sort of like any Batman adaptation. Like it's not necessarily exactly what's on the page, but it's perfectly in keeping with the character. It's really what is the core of this character, what's the core of the story we're telling. And I think Michael Cera does a really great job with that. I mean, I think the same thing is kind of with Ramona. Like Ramona, that's the core of the character. Ramona, she acts a little different. She's a little bit more standoffish in the movie than she is in the book, but it's still pretty much the same character. So Scott's interesting. It's really just how much you can want him to learn and stop being such a fucking tool bag.
And I think that's the interesting thing about this film is a lot of people that I've seen who want to critique Scott Pilgrim versus the World view it as a glorification of like the incel fantasy almost, right? Of the
Yeah. Hmm.
and that is something that did come out of this is so many creepy guys like, oh, you've got that Ramona Flowers energy.
I know. I know.
I really vibe with that. Oh, you're cool and quirky. You want to be like that. This
I
film does
know.
have to answer for women
It does.
everywhere who choose to dye their hair now having to get called a fucking fictional character has nothing to do with why they chose to dye their fucking hair. So that is something that's not the fault of the film itself, it's just
Yeah.
fucking dudes being assholes and creepy. That is a part of this because but I think it's just another thing of just people can watch a thing and just not get what the author is intending, which can sometimes
Yeah.
just still be something you need to deal with, of like what message you're sending out there. But the point of this film, long story short, is that Scott Pilgrim is an asshole, and
Yep.
it's Scott Pilgrim versus the world is because he is making bad choices and he is fighting the world and common sense and what his friends and everyone are telling him to stop being a fucking asshole.
Yep.
He is on his way to becoming one of the evil ex-boyfriends in this film.
Hmm.
Um, and at the end of it is him kind of reconciling that and not healing but beginning the steps to that. We never see Scott Pilgrim get to a place of like, oh, he's a good person now, but we
Yeah.
see him make the choice to try, and that's where we close the door on him and Ramona. In the same way that she's very much got that same baggage. There's a reason why all her failed relationships have ended up like this as well. Is she's carrying a lot of things of being a toxic person herself, and everything to do with that, and it's making that choice um, to take that path of healing with someone who can kind of stick you right. That's really powerful, and that's also really risky because there's a lot of ways
Hmm.
that that can go wrong. And that can be uncomfortable, but I also think it helps that a lot of this film is Scott get his fucking ass kicked.
Yep.
I think it would be one thing if he just walked through these fights and then it would be kind of like a power fantasy, but like a lot of these fights how they end is he finds the gimmick and then he exploits the gimmick, and he wins through like subversion, trickery, or finding a way to get past someone else's own emotional baggage. His emotional baggage runs deeper than yours, so he can beat you because he's a bigger asshole. It's like
Yep.
until he comes across the final boss is the biggest asshole Chad. Fucking dude is
Yep.
literally puts a choker and a slave layers Ramona. Like that's the level of
Hmm.
nerd culture dissection we're getting into this. Is where in a lesser film the final boss would have been uh Chris Evans' character, the jock, the super buff handsome, or even Brandon Routh's, right? Like the
Hmm.
bully. No. Those are assholes, but they're not the level of asshole we need to conquer. That we end this with Scott basically fighting reverse Scott. um,
Yep.
his venom, if you will, and that's how we deal with that. So I really enjoy it on that thing because I love watching flawed characters. My favorite Marvel character is Matt Murdock because he's a fucking mess and he cannot stop hiding his life and the people around him. The best Daredevil stories understand that. That's why I really love this film is because I'm never once am I rooting for Scott. I'm rooting for everyone else around him, but I'm also just so fascinated by seeing this portrait of a very real person uh, going through this journey and at the end making the choice to come out better, which is all it takes for anyone to start doing better, right? Is you just have to make that thing and take that wake up call. Um, so that's I love everything about it. So I guess long answer is I really like Scott Pilgrim because of how much I
Hmm.
dislike Scott Pilgrim.
Yep. Exactly. I think it helps if you're someone like me who like for those that don't know, I did fall pretty hard into the whole like anti-feminist, anti-SJW rabbit hole. Like I fell into that real hard. And so when I got out of it, this book and the story resonated even more for me because I saw a lot of myself in Scott. Like I saw a lot of myself in Scott, and that's never something that you want. Um, and so there's something so raw and emotional about just that story of someone realizing how much they have fucked things up for themselves and how much they have only made things harder for themselves because of their unwillingness to take responsibility. Um, it's such a great, just emotional story, and the trappings of the fights and the video games and stuff just enhances it and makes it just the most entertaining thing ever without losing track of just Scott's quest to start being less of a shitbag.
Hmm.
So it's good stuff. Good
Yeah,
stuff.
it is. Other than Scott, though, what do we? I guess it's because this has got such a large cast. I don't want to put you on someone
Yeah.
specifically. What are some standout characters that you want to take a moment to talk about?
Um, you know, every character does really well. Every character is so well acted. I mean, like I would love to talk about like Lucas Lee, but the thing about like Lucas Lee and like Todd and all the like a lot of them are kind of bit parts, but they're really good. Um, you know, the Todd being a vegan who gets superpowers from being a vegan, like that shit's fucking hilarious. Um, and so I would say, in terms of characters that I really like who are kind of more important, like recurring characters, um, Wallace is one of my absolute favorites. Wallace Wells, his gay roommate, is probably one of my favorite characters, both in this and in the books. He's always providing this like snarky counterpoint to Scott, who he's kind of the one looking at Scott and always just giving him advice in the most snarky fucking way. Like he could easily sit down with Scott and just tell him like, dude, you're being an asshole to people, but he just chooses to watch Scott fucking flounder around and figure it out for himself. Um, Knives is incredible. Knives' character journey is not quite what it is in the comics, but Knives is a phenomenal character. Um, Pitch perfect with the character from the books as far as the acting goes. Um, I would say the big person to talk about is Ramona, because Ramona is kind of a person who's like she's almost like in the middle of that transformation that Scott starts at the end of this, right? Like she's someone who, like she says, she's dabbled in being a bitch, and she is trying to figure this out. So she's kind of in the middle of that journey to be the best version of herself. Um, and so when she's with Scott, you kind of sense this frustration of like wanting Scott to start being better and things like that. And so they always have a very kind of interesting dynamic to me. And it's funny because originally the movie ended with Scott getting back with Knives, which I think would have been a big mistake. Test audiences hated it, so they had him get with Ramona at the end, because that was just another way they were going to try to be different from the comic. I think that was probably the smart move, though.
Hmm. And I think that's better as well because just in general terms, I can't speak for it, but probably like the reason why the test audience is my thing is just because like you spend a lot of it was like Ramona is is the gal of the story, right? The Princess Peach. She's the
Yeah.
part. She's nobody. She's the goal or something, right?
Hmm.
And I imagine a lot of people think of it in those terms of maybe even some critics review this as way is like, oh, he wins Ramona, the person he wanted to do. Whereas like if he was with Knives, it might have been a story of like, oh, you realize the person who was with you all along is who's best for you. No, 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 no. That's not what's happening here. What's happening
Hmm.
here is Scott realizes that Knives is a good person.
Yeah.
And he doesn't need to be with Knives because all he's gonna do with Knives is fucking drag her down
Oh
and
yeah.
hurt her. With Ramona, they've come to an understanding when they both realize they come from a very bad place, and together they can recognize that and find a way to move forward. Because they have that emotional honesty after that point.
And it's not even like he wins Ramona. Like if you're gonna boil it down to those terms, what he wins is the chance to start over with
Yeah.
Ramona.
He gets an
Like
extra
he
life.
he wins. Yeah, he wins the chance to try again. He might fuck it up. Like you don't know. So it's not like he wins her and it's ever happily ever after. Like obviously you hope for both of their sakes that it is kind of a happily ever after because you do see a genuine connection with them. But I mean that's really what it is. He gets to he wins the chance to get to prove that he did learn what he just learned over the course of the film.
Hmm. It's something where again it's just a very untypical ending. But it's in the trappings of if you look at it very simply out of context, you look at like a plot summary or something, people could make that assumption. So it's something I think to be considered just in the discussion to bring up, even if it's just to bring up to debunk it, right?
Hmm.
But that's, yeah, it's one of those things where throughout all of this film, I think the female characters are written very strongly, specifically in that they have such a honesty to them where they're not helpless, ditzy, or dumb, but they're also not infallible, intelligent, and they're just written as human beings, which is so
Hmm.
rare. But they're not in the nebulous sense of oh, there's no difference between men and women. They are written as women, as human beings, as honestly as it can be, which is so rare to get that surprisingly fine line
Hmm.
for some people to just treat women as like, oh yeah, they can be horny too. And they can be bitches, oh, but they can also be sweet, and they can also fall in love
Yep.
so hard and have their hearts broken. And every single aspect of that gives these characters such a real human way. And I think that's what I want to give to the main cast at least, is all of them feel so human that then when you get to the superhumans, the larger than
Yeah.
life characters, with the evil exes, that's where you get to have the fun. I can't imagine how fun it must have been to be on set for this film, playing specifically the evil exes. That's like a dream role. Like everyone wants to play the villains, but I want to play like the goofy villains. I want to
Yeah.
play the larger than life villains. I think Chris Evans. I
Oh my
forget.
God, he's
I
so
I
good.
forget his name, but he might
Lucas
legit.
Lee.
Lewis Lee might be the funniest fucking gag I've ever seen in the film of like all time. I lose my shit every time because it's that's another thing where like we talk about the director and the script, but the actors make this so much with the delivery and
Yeah.
keeping up with the cuts. Like if the cuts were so frantic, but the actors couldn't match that energy. I don't know how Edgar Wright makes his films, man. I don't know how you film on the day and then when you go to the editing room, you just make this magic. Like it baffles me the inner workings of his five-dimensional mind. Because you have to think on a fifth-dimensional level to make this film. But like the
Yep.
fucking Die Hard, like every action move ever, like introduction to him, where he fucking
Yep.
open up the phone booth. Oh, tears come to my eyes. Legitimate tears come to my eyes of just pure hilarity of just that hits me in a certain spot.
The the Yeah, when he's walking away from Scott and the stunt team is beating on him, he's got this improv line where he like looks at his phone and he's like, "That's actually hilarious." That makes me lose it every time, and I don't know why. It's so good.
Mhm.
It's oh my
It's nutty. So he's definitely my favorite of the evil exes. Who's your favorite of the exes specifically?
it's a toss up between him and Lucas Lee and Todd, but I would say probably Todd. Um, just the gag reveal of like when he lifts Scott up and he's like holding him psychically, and Bree is just like, "Didn't you know Todd's vegan?" Like that's the only explanation you need or get. It's so good. Um, I like I can't even tell you how much I lost my shit seeing this in the theaters when they introduced Todd's like vegan powers. Um, Todd in the comics is really interesting because this is one of the changes I think is actually better in the books than it is in the comics. In the comics, what am I trying to say? In the movie, Scott actually tricks Todd into drinking something that's not vegan, and so that's when the vegan police show up and de-veganize him. In the books, that happens just purely out of like, there's even a joke where Scott's like, man, I really need a poorly set up Deus Ex Machina right now, and then the vegan police just show up. But he doesn't like do anything to like trick Todd into breaking vegan code. We just see Todd, like we get to see him eat gelato, like they reference in the movie. We actually see that in the comic, and him being like, I'm a fucking rock star. I can do what I want. So like one of the changes they made there was actually making Scott kind of clever and actually getting him to drink something that wasn't vegan. And so that's one of the changes I thought was actually really good. But for the most part, like the whole bit with the cleaning lady, all that stuff, that's all in the book and it's all great. And I love Todd. Todd's probably my favorite, followed by Lucas. And I think Roxy really gets overlooked because Mae Whitman does a great job as Roxy. Like because the Caddy and Augie twins are the only ones that don't really get much screen time, but everyone else is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. It's such a wow. I guess just even with the roles that are like bit parts, they didn't skimp on the casting. They
No.
didn't find a.
I mean, it's an all-star cast.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's Chris Evans, Brandon Routh, fucking, Michael Cera and Brie Larson. And I mean, like Brie Larson was not as big at the time as she is now, but I mean, like looking back, it's a fucking like.
It's an MCU
it's quite,
prediction board.
Yeah, it is. So I mean, they, like I said, not a single thing in the casting is amiss here. I mean, you got Aubrey Plaza and you've got Anna Kendrick. Like you've got just so many great actors and actresses.
Mm-hmm. It's every part of it just lets you know that there was just love put into it. Even outside of like love for an adaptation, but love just for the pure joy of the material and getting to, from the actors' points of view, that everyone's having fun with it. The direction, again, like we say, but I also, for another thing, because you mentioned it earlier, I think this is a big part of this film and why it rips so much shit specifically, is the soundtrack. The soundtrack for Scott Pilgrim versus the World is fucking god tier.
It's god tier. It's funny too because Sex Bob-omb is a much better band in the movie than they are in the books. Like they are a shitty band in the books. Like they make sure you know that. But then the opening starts, and they've got that opening number for the opening credits, and it's a fucking banger. So like even just their band has some great tracks. Like I said, you've got the Black Sheep song by Metric that Clash at Demon Head plays. And then the score, not only the score, but like they use the actual fairy fountain theme from Legend of Zelda, and shit like that. Like they're not like, they will go those places and actually use those things, which is crazy. I mean, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it lets you just, I think that's also just as well as another example of what works in a comic book versus what works in the film. Is in a comic book, you can't hear the music.
Exactly.
If you say how good they are, that's going to feel fake. But if you just write bad lyrics on a page, you can get it, and it's a funny joke, right? You can't write, even if you did write good lyrics on a page, it still probably wouldn't hit, because just without the music and just on its own, it wouldn't work for that medium. But with a movie, if you're having the music come on and it's actually bad, that could be funny, but given it's such a part of this movie, it would get really uncomfortable, and it wouldn't give it that kind of pumped up energy that you're supposed to for the film. And I think it also gives a little indication as well, like early on, of what Scott's quote unquote power is. If he did become an evil X, he would have been the one with the band. Another one with a band, I mean. They've all got fucking bands. But like, that gives you a clear example of that. So I feel like that's another great example of, this is what happens when you add music to a piece. You can't just do that absent-mindedly. You have to think about that. That would have been a conversation they would have had, right, in pre-production. It's like, all right, is the music actually bad? And he's like, okay, well, if you say it, the actual lyrics, like you've got that really good scene with I'm sad, and it's like, boom,
I'm
thank
so very, very sad.
thank
Yeah.
you, and it's just like
So
that. Like
sad.
that's a funny gag, but that's also like kind
Yeah.
of hype the moment you get for that thing. But at the same time, you can't keep that energy for the whole film when this is so music
Yeah.
focused and there are so many scenes played to music. So no, that's a really good point to bring up. Other than
Yeah.
that, then, because we are kind of getting close to where we need to wrap up, do you have any other thoughts you want to go over? Any other places you haven't touched on that we've got some time to cover? Because again, you had some prep time for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too much into spoilers for the books necessarily. I mean, the books have been out since 2010, so fucking go read them. But the bit at the end, like, so you've got Gideon, who is kind of the opposite of Scott. Like, he's way more of kind of a weirdo dork in this than he is in the comics. Like in the comics, he's a little bit more like calm and cold and calculated, but still kind of a dork. Whereas this, Jason Schwartzman just fucking like goes for it, and it's great. Um, the whole him having a chip on the back of Ramona's head, that is an abandoned idea that Brian Lee O'Malley had. Like that was one of the initial ideas for how everything was going to shake out. The book is way trippier when it's revealed what's actually going on. It's way more bizarre. I had to reread it a couple times to be like, wait, what the fuck is happening? Because the whole like subspace highway that goes through people's heads, that plays a much bigger role in the book. And so Gideon is much more fucked up in the books and things like that. But it's cool that rather than trying to adapt that, because that ending, it's not bad, it's just very batshit crazy, and that the ending of the books relies on the setup of like all these books. So rather than trying to adapt that and going for something simpler that still gets the point across, is kind of a microcosm of really this whole adaptation. Because I would say Gideon is the other like major character that's kind of interesting to talk about thematically because of the way he's that character that I always love. He's that character that represents what the protagonist could easily become or turn into. Because they do have Nega Scott in this, but they just play him for a joke. Whereas in the comics, Nega Scott is something Scott actually has to fight. I feel like I don't have anything much more of substance to say. That's not just me like geeking out about this movie though, to be honest with you.
I mean, that's been pretty entertaining, so I'm fine with letting you do that as well. But yeah, this has just been. I always enjoy the excuse to go back and watch this film. So when you suggested this, I was like, okay, yay. But talking
Yeah.
to you now has made. I was always. It's always one of those things. I've got so many things to read and catch up on. I was always like, oh, I'll read the Scott Pilgrim comics one day. But hearing you talk about it and like the gushes of it, and now it's fresh in my mind, I think I will give those a look see, and then we could do a geeky gentleman on that down the line. Once I've got those in them about, those would be fun.
Yeah, I'd love to. They're really good. You get a lot more. There's a lot more backstory stuff, so you get like a lot of, because like there's a line in the movie where she's like grilling him about his relationship with Kim, and he's like, I had to fight a dude to be with her. I had to fight a big 70-foot tall purple suited dude, and I punched him so hard he saw the curvature of the earth. That happens in the books, but it's not. The book really plays into this idea of Scott not remembering things the way that they actually were. Like that's a big portion of the book, is like characters who just are not remembering things the way they are and making things more than what they were and making themselves out to be more than what they were. There's a lot of that in the books. And so there's a lot of really cool callbacks like that. Also, Scott's 22 in the book, and he's 23. No, he's 23 in the book, but he's 22 in the movie, and I don't know why. That's all. That's it. That's all I got. That's it.
Maybe that extra year is how it makes it even more creepy.
I will say it's kind of creepy in the book, because in the book it does take place over a year, and they like keep hanging out with knives after they break up. And there's like a bunch of 20-somethings are just like hanging out with the 17-year-old. It's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird. That's like the one thing in the book that's kind of weird.
It's also part of kind of like the dealing with it, right? It's that kind of weird. you can believe that happened though, right?
Yeah.
Is,
Oh
is
yeah.
that it's
Oh
kind
yeah.
of that it's that real weirdness which gets more uncomfortable because you know it happens. So when it's depicted in media, like, oh, I don't I knew people like that. I knew fucking cliques in high school like that. I don't want to remember that. Let's not go there. But it's part of the dealing with it. So I think that's a good thing. All right then. First thing I want to do is, if people would notice, the lovely, wonderful, intelligent, fantastic, and handsome Steve Baxi was not able to make it today. But his thoughts on the film were as verbatim. He loves the film. He thinks it's a good cure for a bad mood. That's his fucking 5-star review. That it's a glowing. He succinctly puts up. We can't just say that at the start, because then what would be the point of me and Matt failing to try and live up to his eloquent wording for the record?
Seriously.
So we're just gonna leave it. We're gonna leave it with Steve's fucking closing thoughts. Would you want to give it a rating for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World?
Yeah, for sure. I will give this fucking 5 out of 5 chain whip swords that are right out of fucking Soul Calibur. That's what Roxy uses, and it's great, and I love it.
For me, I'm gonna give this one 4 point. No, fuck it. Just stop being pretentious, Dick Alfie. No one likes you. 5 out of 5. Um, phone booths.
Yeah.
Because if you know, you know. That's what me. That's if I was an evil ex-boyfriend of Ramona Flowers, which is
Yeah.
highly likely at this point, given my fucking sordid relationship history. So like I'm the secret boss. I'm the ninth. The fucking bit for me is I would just be Lewis Lee, but as like a YouTuber. So all my stunt doubles would just be my fucking subscribers.
That's exactly the shit. Like if they like rebooted this or whatever, that's it. That's it. Like don't change anything about the story, but like the evil X's are all like fucking much more like millennial things. Like one of them was just like a famous Twitch streamer or some
Yeah, well,
shit.
the
Just like
streamer.
that's yeah.
One donated to Ramona Flowers OnlyFans and just stalked her
Yes,
forever. Yep,
exactly.
that's
Yep.
exactly where you
Exactly.
go with
Hmm.
it.
Yep.
But yeah, but with that said and done, we have a topic for next week, which is going to be a discussion topic picked by, once again, the beautiful, wonderful, amazing Steve Baxi. And it is, what are three? So you have to pick three specifically. So we're not going to talk about the idea in general. We're going to each pick three and then come and discuss three, all right? Projects that never happened that you wish did. So projects that were in
Oh
development or were pitched
fuck.
that never happened. There's a lot of fucking ones right there to talk
So
about,
many.
but you have to narrow
So
it down to
fucking.
three. So look forward to that next week with the dark philosopher will return, and it will be followed by his two faithful sidekicks. I am a geek for fun. We have been your geeky gentlemen, and I am also, in addition to being a geek for fun, the champion of the oppressed.
I'm the Sonic erotica lover.
And we will be discussing things. A 1, 2, 3, 4.